I'm standing in my own kitchen, the light above the sink flickering like it's unsure whether to stay on, holding a mug that says Forever Us, and realizing the word us has quietly expired. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't slam a door. He just looks past me, already somewhere else, and says the sentence that will split my life into before and after. The sentence that will make me agree to something that sounds fair and turns out to be devastating. In 30 seconds, everything you think you know about love, loyalty, and power will tilt, and you'll feel it in your chest before you understand it with your head. Welcome to my YouTube channel. This is my story of betrayal, and if you've ever trusted the wrong person, hit that subscribe button because you are not alone. Here is how it happened. I used to believe promotions were celebrations, balloons, champagne, a phone buzzing with congratulations. I believed titles meant security, that we'd rise together, that we was a permanent state. On the day my husband became vice president, the air around him changed. It was subtle at first, like the room had gained an extra degree of heat. He stood taller. He listened differently. He began to speak in sentences that started with I instead of we. And I told myself it was temporary. I told myself success makes people weird before it makes them grateful. I remember the elevator ride the night it all crystallized, the doors closed with a polite ding, trapping us in a mirrored box. He was scrolling on his phone, smiling at a message that wasn't for me. The VP title still felt new enough to shine, and the reflection of it lit his face. I made a joke, something small, something safe, about how we should finally plan that trip we'd postponed for years. He didn't laugh. He didn't even look up. He said we'd talk later. Later never came. At home, the apartment felt staged, like a model unit no one lives in. Our photos lined the hallway, but they looked like artifacts from a museum called Us. He loosened his tie, poured himself a drink, and said he wanted to reset expectations. That phrase should have warned me. Corporate language doesn't belong in kitchens. It belongs in boardrooms where people get laid off with a smile. Then he said it calmly, cleanly, like a policy update. I pay for my life, you figure out yours. He said it as if it were reasonable, as if it were progressive, as if independence had suddenly become a virtue only for him. My mouth opened, but the words got stuck somewhere between shock and disbelief. I heard my own heartbeat louder than his voice. I asked what he meant. He repeated it, slower, as if clarity would soften the blow. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I did the thing women are taught to do when something feels unfair but sounds logical. I agreed. I said okay. I said we could be modern about it. I said I could handle my own expenses. I said it with a smile that felt borrowed from someone braver. And the moment I agreed, I felt the ground move just a little under my feet. Here's what he didn't say out loud. The rent would stay the same, but the power wouldn't. The rules would change, but only for me. His promotion didn't just come with a bigger paycheck. It came with permission to rewrite the story of our marriage in his favor. I was reading comments on my YouTube videos the other day, and I realized I wasn't the only one. People wrote about the moment they agreed to something that sounded equal and woke up to find it wasn't. They wrote about partners who climbed ladders and kicked them away. They wrote about quiet sentences that did loud damage. I saw myself in their words before I ever told you mine. At first, the new arrangement felt fine. I told myself I liked the independence. I paid my share, I tracked my spending, and I felt proud when I covered groceries without asking. He covered his suits, his dinners, his ride shares that came home late. We split utilities like a spreadsheet with feelings removed. We called it fairness. We called it adult. We didn't call it love. But something else shifted too. Decisions started happening without me. Vacations became business trips. Dinners became client meetings. I became an afterthought in my own home, someone who needed to be informed, not consulted. When I brought it up, he said I was overthinking. When I pushed back, he said I was being emotional. When I went quiet, he said nothing. I noticed the language creep in. My place, my schedule, my money. Our life became a series of transactions, and affection started requiring an invoice. If I wanted time, I had to book it. If I wanted reassurance, I had to earn it. The VP title sat between us at the table, an invisible third person who always took his side. One night, I opened our shared drawer and realized it wasn't shared anymore. His documents were locked, his calendar was private, his phone face down. Trust, once a given, had become a request with conditions. I asked him if there was someone else. He laughed, not because it was funny, but because he was offended I'd ask. He said success makes people suspicious. He said I should be grateful. Grateful for being demoted in my own marriage. I started keeping notes, not because I planned to leave, but because I needed proof I wasn't imagining the erosion. Dates, words, the way his eyes slid past me when his phone buzzed, the way he corrected me in front of others, gently, professionally, like I was an intern who needed guidance. The way he introduced me without a title, no wife, no partner, just my name. And then came the dinner that changed everything, the one where a single comment, said too casually to take back, revealed what this arrangement was really about. I didn't know it yet, but by the end of that night, I would understand the cost of agreeing. I would realize that independence, when imposed, is just another form of control. The fork paused halfway to my mouth, the room went quiet, and he smiled as he spoke, leaving me to decide in that exact second whether I would keep playing by rules designed to make me small or finally flip the board. The fork stayed suspended between my plate and my mouth longer than it should have. Across the table, he smiled, not warmly, not cruelly, but with the effortless ease of a man who believes he has already won. The restaurant buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses, a celebration dinner his colleagues had insisted on after the promotion. I was the only one at the table who felt like an outsider wearing a familiar face. He leaned back in his chair and said it, almost as an aside. You know, now that things are separate, it's easier if you don't expect to come to all these events. They're strategic. Strategic, another word that didn't belong between bites of pasta. I nodded. I nodded because that had become my reflex. Agree now, process later. Agree now, survive later. The others were laughing about bonuses and travel perks, about stock options and corner offices. Someone asked me how it felt to have a VP husband. I smiled again, my face had learned the choreography, and said I was proud. What I didn't say was that pride had started to taste like metal. On the ride home, he was energized, buzzing from attention. He talked about the future like a man drafting blueprints for a skyscraper, ambitious, precise, vertical. There was no place on those plans for a shared foundation. When I mentioned that I felt invisible at dinner, he sighed like a teacher correcting a slow student. "This is the reality of my level now," he said. "You'll adjust." Adjust, another instruction, another quiet command disguised as advice. That night he fell asleep quickly, phone face down on the nightstand, suit jacket draped carefully over the chair like a symbol of rank. I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan, counting rotations, wondering when I'd stopped being his equal and started being an accessory he could remove when inconvenient. The next weeks unfolded like a slow leak. Nothing dramatic, no explosions, just the steady drip of small exclusions. He stopped asking what I thought. He stopped telling me where he was going. He stopped noticing when I was late or quiet or tired. The separate finances, which I'd agreed to so bravely, became a ledger he could point to whenever I needed something. "That's not in my budget," he'd say, even when we needed it, even when it was for the house, even when it was for us. I took on extra freelance work to keep up, long nights, early mornings. I told myself it was temporary, that once he settled into the role, things would soften. But power, I learned, doesn't soften. It clarifies. It shows you who someone really is when they no longer need you the way they once did. One afternoon, while folding laundry that somehow still felt like my responsibility, I found a receipt in his pocket. An expensive restaurant, a weekday lunch, 2 entrees, 2 desserts. I stared at the paper longer than necessary, memorizing the date. I asked him about it casually, the way you do when you're hoping to be reassured. He didn't flinch. "Client meeting," he said. "You don't need to audit me." Audit, as if curiosity were an accusation, as if marriage were a balance sheet. I started noticing patterns, late nights clustered around the same days, new cologne, subtle, expensive, a lock code change on his phone that he didn't bother to explain. When I reached for him, he felt elsewhere, present in body, absent in every other way. When I tried to talk, he accused me of insecurity. When I cried, he said he didn't have the bandwidth. One evening, I suggested couples counseling. The word barely left my mouth before his expression hardened. "I don't need therapy. I need a partner who can keep up." Keep up? With what? His ambition? His detachment? The version of him that no longer saw me as a teammate, but as a liability? I remembered the early years then, the nights we planned futures on cheap takeout boxes, the way he used to ask my opinion on everything, from job offers to fonts on presentations. Back then, my belief in him felt like fuel. Now it felt like something he'd already burned through. The comments on my channel kept echoing in my head, stories of women who watched success turn into entitlement, men who rewrote history once they no longer needed witnesses. I realized I was living inside the warning signs people leave behind for strangers. The breaking point didn't come as a scream. It came as a spreadsheet. He sat me down one Sunday morning, coffee in hand, calm as ever. He opened his laptop and showed me a breakdown of expenses. His expenses, my expenses, what he thought was fair. He suggested we reevaluate the apartment. Maybe I could move to something more manageable for my income. He said it kindly, reasonably, as if he were doing me a favor. I stared at the screen, at the neat rows and columns that reduced years of shared life to numbers. "You want me to move out?" I said slowly. "No," he replied. "I want you to be realistic." Realistic. The word landed harder than I expected, because suddenly I was being asked to accept a reality where love had conditions, where partnership had an expiration date tied to salary bands, a reality where agreeing had cost me leverage, safety, voice. I didn't answer him then. I closed the laptop gently, afraid of what might spill out of me if I didn't. I went for a walk instead, letting the city noise swallow my thoughts. Somewhere between the crosswalk and the cafe on the corner, something inside me hardened, not into anger, but into clarity. That night, while he showered, his phone lit up on the bed. A message preview flashed just long enough to read the name. A woman I didn't know. A single line. "I miss you too." My hands didn't shake, my heart didn't race, there was no dramatic gasp, just a quiet click, like a lock finally turning. All the little pieces aligned, the late nights, the secrecy, the way separation had been framed as progress. It wasn't about fairness, it never was. It was about freedom for him. When he came out of the bathroom, towel around his waist, I looked up and asked very calmly, "Who is she?" He froze. In that silence, thick, heavy, undeniable, I understood something essential. Agreeing never protected me. It had only delayed the truth. And now, with everything laid bare, I had a choice to make that would change not just my marriage, but the story I told myself about my worth. He opened his mouth to answer, and I realized for the first time that whatever he said next would no longer define me, but it might finally set me free. He didn't answer right away. That was the first answer. The bathroom steam drifted into the bedroom, carrying the faint scent of eucalyptus and the expensive soap he'd started using, another detail I'd filed away without comment. His eyes flicked to the phone on the bed, then back to me. In that split second, I watched calculation replace surprise, damage control mode, executive mode. "It's nothing," he said finally. "A colleague. We've been working late." I nodded slowly, the way you do when you're giving someone room to keep lying if they choose to. "Then why does she say she misses you?" His jaw tightened. "You're reading things out of context." Context. Always context. Context was the word people used when the truth was inconvenient. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I asked again, softer this time, because I wanted to see which version of himself he'd choose. "Who is she?" He exhaled sharply and sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly tired, suddenly burdened. "This is exactly what I mean," he said. "Ever since the promotion, you've been different, suspicious, insecure. You're turning nothing into a problem." There it was, the pivot. Make me the issue. I'd seen it in the comments, read it in other women's stories, but living it felt surreal, like watching a familiar movie with a new ending where the villain knows your name. "So you're saying I imagined the message?" I asked. "I'm saying you violated my privacy," he replied coolly, "and now you're projecting." Projecting, another word from the corporate handbook of deflection. I stood up, my legs steadier than I expected. "You changed the rules," I said. "You separated our lives. You told me to figure out mine, and now you're surprised I'm paying attention." His eyes narrowed. "Don't twist this." But that was the thing. I wasn't twisting anything anymore. I was untangling it. The argument that followed wasn't loud. It was surgical. He explained how demanding his role was, how lonely leadership could be, how he needed someone who understood the pressure, someone who didn't make everything about feelings. He never admitted to an affair. He didn't have to. The justifications were confession enough. I listened. I really did. And as he spoke, I felt something lift off me, a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying, the responsibility of holding us together, the belief that if I just adjusted enough, bent enough, loved harder, things would return to what they were. They wouldn't, because what they were depended on me being smaller. When he finished, he looked at me like he was waiting for a verdict, for tears, for forgiveness, for compliance. Instead, I said the sentence that surprised us both. "I want space." He laughed, not cruelly, nervously. He said, "You already have space. That was the agreement." "No," I replied. "You have space. I have distance. There's a difference." The next few days passed in an eerie calm. He stayed late, I stayed quiet. We moved around each other like strangers sharing a lease. I began packing small things, documents, sentimental items without making a show of it. I opened a new bank account. I called an old friend I hadn't spoken to in years. Each action felt like reclaiming oxygen. One evening, he noticed the boxes. "What's this?" he asked. "I'm being realistic," I said, using his word, watching it land. His expression hardened. "You're overreacting." That phrase used to paralyze me. Now it clarified everything. Overreacting was what he called any reaction he couldn't control. I moved out 2 weeks later, not in a dramatic exit, but in stages, suitcase by suitcase, memory by memory. The apartment I found was smaller, louder, imperfect, but it was mine, and for the first time in months, I slept through the night. He texted, he called. His tone shifted from annoyed to concerned to wounded. He said we could renegotiate. He said he'd been under pressure. He said he missed me. What he never said was, "I'm sorry." What he never asked was, "What do you need?" I started posting more consistently on my YouTube channel then, not about him, not directly, about independence, about quiet red flags, about the danger of agreeing to arrangements that erase you.
The comments flooded in, women thanking me, men arguing, stories pouring out like confessionals. I wasn't alone anymore, and neither were they. One night, months after I moved out, he asked to meet. Neutral ground, coffee shop. Closure, he said. He looked different, tired, less polished. The VP title hadn't cushioned him the way he thought it would. He told me the relationship with a colleague hadn't worked out, that things were complicated, that he'd made mistakes. I thought separating things would make us stronger, he said quietly. No, I replied, you thought it would make you freer. He flinched. I didn't take it back. We sat in silence, the hum of the espresso machine filling the space where apologies should have been. I realized then that I didn't want revenge. I didn't even want validation. I wanted to be done measuring myself against his version of success. As I stood to leave, he asked the question I knew was coming. So, this is it? I smiled, not sadly, not bitterly, clearly. This is me figuring out my life, just like you told me to. He didn't follow me out. That night, back in my apartment, I sat on the floor and cried, not because I missed him, but because I stayed so long after the truth had already arrived. I cried for the woman who thought agreeing was the same as choosing, for the woman who believed love could survive on unequal ground. And then I stopped crying, because the story wasn't over, not even close. What I didn't know yet was that my agreement, the one that almost broke me, had set off a chain of events he never anticipated, events that would bring everything he tried to control back into the light, publicly, permanently. And when that moment came, I would have to decide whether to stay silent or finally tell the whole truth.
Silence has a sound when you finally choose it. It's not empty, it hums. In my new apartment, that hum wrapped around me at night, unfamiliar but honest. No negotiations, no explaining, no performing gratitude for crumbs. Just me, the city outside my window, and the slow, steady rebuilding of a self I'd put on layaway. I thought the worst was over. I was wrong. It started with an email. Subject line, quick question. Sender, human resources. I stared at the screen, my stomach tightening in a way that felt ancient. HR emails are never just questions. They are invitations to step carefully. The message was polite, neutral. They were conducting a routine internal review and wanted to confirm my availability for a brief call. They referenced my husband's department, former husband's department, I corrected myself, and mentioned my name had come up in passing. In passing, like debris. I called a friend before I replied. She listened quietly, then said, "This is where you don't panic. This is where you tell the truth and nothing extra." Her voice grounded me. I replied, yes. I scheduled the call. I made tea. I reminded myself I had nothing to hide. The HR representative sounded young, careful. She asked general questions at first, how long we'd been married, whether we'd attended company events together, whether I'd ever been present for client dinners. Then her tone shifted, just slightly. "Were you aware of any relationships your husband may have had with colleagues?" she asked. There it was. I paused, the kettle clicking off in the background like punctuation. "I became aware of something after we separated," I said, choosing each word with intention. "I don't have details." She thanked me. She said that was all. She said they might follow up. The call ended and I sat very still, listening to the hum of silence turn sharp. That night he called for the first time in weeks. "Did HR contact you?" he asked, skipping hello. "Yes," I said. "What did you say?" His voice wasn't angry, it was afraid. I told the truth. There was a long pause. "You didn't need to involve yourself," he said finally. "This could affect my career." I laughed then, one short surprise sound. "Funny," I replied. "You didn't seem worried about my life when you told me to figure it out."
He hung up. The next weeks unfolded like a slow-motion reveal. Rumors surfaced, not from me, not from anything I said, but from a pattern he'd left behind. Expense reports that didn't add up, calendars that overlapped, complaints that had been dismissed when he was still rising. Power protects until it doesn't. I kept my distance. I focused on work, on my channel, on messages from people who said my videos helped them leave situations they'd been minimizing for years. Every time I hit upload, I felt a little more solid. Then the article dropped. A business blog, not a tabloid, published a piece about leadership ethics and workplace boundaries. It didn't name him directly, but the details were unmistakable. A recently promoted VP, an undisclosed relationship, policy violations, an internal investigation underway. My phone exploded. Friends, family, even people I hadn't spoken to since college. Some were concerned, some were curious, a few were cruel. I didn't respond. I didn't owe anyone a statement. He texted at midnight, "You're enjoying this." I stared at the words, then typed back, "I'm surviving it." He called the next day, voice tight, controlled. He said the investigation was serious. He said people were misinterpreting things. He said he needed support. "I supported you for years. I just didn't realize it was optional." He asked if I'd talk to HR again, if I'd clarify, if I'd help. The audacity stunned me, not because it was new, but because it was so consistent. Even now, even here, he believed my role was to cushion his fall. "I won't lie for you," he snapped. "I'm not asking you to lie, just frame it differently." That's when I understood something essential. He didn't see truth as truth. He saw it as a resource, something to be managed, spun, deployed. I said no, calmly, clearly, and for the first time I felt the power dynamic flip, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, irreversible one. Days later, HR called again. This time, the questions were more direct. I answered them without embellishment, without bitterness, without fear. When the call ended, I went for a walk, letting the air cool my skin, letting the city remind me that life was larger than his fall down. The outcome came faster than I expected. He was placed on leave. Temporary, they said, pending review. He showed up at my apartment that evening unannounced, standing in the hallway with a face I barely recognized. The confidence was gone, the polish cracked. He looked like a man who'd built a ladder and kicked away the wrong rung. "This is because of you," he said, not shouting but sharp enough to cut. I didn't invite him in. "No," I replied, "this is because of you." He accused me of betrayal, of timing, of disloyalty. I listened, then said the thing that had been waiting years to be spoken. "I taught you how to live separately," I said. "I'm just applying the lesson." He left without another word. That night I uploaded a video, not naming him, not recounting details, but talking about the moment when silence becomes complicity, about the cost of protecting people who wouldn't protect you. The comments poured in faster than ever, strangers telling me I'd put words to something they'd felt but never said. And then, among the comments, I saw a familiar name, his. A long message, defensive, carefully worded, public. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with anticipation, because I knew what came next. If I responded, it would escalate. If I stayed silent, it would linger. Either way, the story was no longer private. I closed the app without replying. But I didn't sleep, because the truth has momentum, and once it starts moving, it doesn't ask permission before it changes everything. The question wasn't whether more would come out. The question was whether I would finally tell the part of the story I'd been protecting him from all along.
I didn't reply to his comment. Not that night, not the next morning, not even when people started tagging me under it, asking questions, drawing conclusions, filling in gaps with their own stories.
Silence, I'd learned, could be an answer or a mirror, and I wanted him to sit with his reflection a little longer. But silence doesn't stop momentum, it sharpens it. Within days, the investigation stopped being a rumor and started being a reality everyone acknowledged in lowered voices. He was officially on administrative leave. His profile disappeared from the company website. His calendar, once booked solid weeks in advance, emptied out like a theater after the final act. Power, I noticed, is loud when it arrives and very quiet when it leaves. He called again. This time, his voice didn't carry authority or accusation. It carried panic. "They're asking about finances," he said, "about our arrangement." Our arrangement. The words hung between us like a shared crime scene. I said nothing. "They want to know why things changed after the promotion," he continued, "why we separated finances so suddenly. They're trying to establish a pattern." A pattern. I almost laughed, because patterns are just truths that repeat long enough to become undeniable. "What do you want from me?" I asked. Another pause, longer this time. "I need you to say it was mutual," he finally said, "that it was your idea too, that you wanted independence." There it was, the ask he'd been building toward. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, reputation management. I closed my eyes, memories flashing in quick succession, the kitchen light flickering, the spreadsheet on the laptop, the message on his phone, the way he'd smiled when he said, "Figure out yours." I thought about how easily I'd agreed, how expensive that agreement had been. "It wasn't mutual," I said quietly. "It was presented as non-negotiable." His voice hardened. "If you don't help me, this could end everything I've worked for." I opened my eyes. "I already decided what my life was worth," I replied. "I'm not going to negotiate it again." He hung up without goodbye. That night, I sat with my laptop open, cursor blinking on a new video draft. I stared at the screen for a long time, fingers hovering. I knew exactly what people wanted next. They wanted the story, the details, the villain. They wanted names and timelines and receipts. I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Instead, I recorded something different. I talked about coercive fairness, how some arrangements look equal on paper but erase one person in practice. I talked about the danger of agreeing under emotional pressure. I talked about how power reframes itself as logic to avoid accountability. I didn't mention him, but everyone knew. The video exploded. Views climbed faster than anything I'd posted before. Comments multiplied. Articles were shared. Someone clipped a 30-second segment and posted it on another platform where it took on a life of its own. People started stitching their own stories onto mine, turning it into a chorus, a pattern. Then the emails started. Journalists, podcasters, bloggers. Most were respectful, some were not. All wanted me to say more, to confirm, to expose, to finish the story they were already telling without me. I declined, every single one. Not because I was protecting him, but because I was protecting myself. I needed to choose the timing of my own truth. I needed to make sure that when I spoke, it would be from strength, not reaction. He didn't see it that way. He sent messages I didn't respond to, long ones, short ones, apologies that curved sharply into blame. He accused me of enjoying the attention, of weaponizing vulnerability, of destroying him out of spite. What he never accused me of was lying. The company reached out again, this time through legal counsel. Formal language, clear boundaries. They asked if I'd be willing to provide a written statement. I asked for time. That weekend, I went back through my notes, dates, messages, screenshots I'd saved without knowing why. It felt like assembling evidence in a case I hadn't intended to file, but one that had been filed anyway, simply by the accumulation of truth. As I read, something unexpected happened. I stopped feeling angry. Anger requires hope that something could have been different. What I felt instead was clarity, a clean, almost clinical understanding of how I'd been maneuvered into agreeing, how separation was framed as maturity, how my silence was mistaken for consent. I wrote the statement. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cruel, it didn't speculate or accuse beyond what I knew. It simply described what had happened, in order, without emotion. Facts have their own weight, they don't need embellishment. When I sent it, my hands didn't shake. 2 weeks later, the decision came. He was asked to resign. Not fired, not publicly disgraced, quietly removed, a negotiated exit, a severance package that acknowledged wrongdoing without admitting liability, corporate mercy, carefully calculated. He texted me one last time, "I hope you're happy." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying, "I hope I'm honest for the rest of my life." He didn't respond. The fallout was stranger than I expected. Some people treated me like a hero, others like a traitor. A few mutual friends drifted away, uncomfortable with the idea that proximity to power could collapse so suddenly. I let them go. You learn quickly who needs your silence to feel safe. My channel grew beyond anything I'd imagined, but with growth came responsibility. I felt it every time someone wrote, "Your story gave me the courage to leave," or "I agreed to something that's killing me and I don't know how to undo it." I started planning a video I hadn't wanted to make, the one where I told the story from the beginning, not for revenge, not for clicks, but because silence, I'd learned, protects the wrong people when it goes on too long. I drafted the outline late one night, the title staring back at me like a dare. I hesitated, because once it was out there would be no pulling it back, no quiet resolutions, no private reckoning. The story would belong to everyone, and to me in a way it never had before. I hovered over the publish button, heart steady, breath slow, knowing that the next choice I made wouldn't just close a chapter, it would redefine the ending. And I had to decide right then whether I was ready to tell the part that would change how people saw him forever, and how they saw me.
The night before I filmed that video, I barely slept. Not because I was afraid of him, but because I was afraid of the finality. Once words leave your mouth and settle into the world, they don't come back. They live on other people's screens, in their interpretations, in headlines you don't get to write. I sat at my desk just before sunrise, the city still half asleep, coffee cooling beside me. I reread the outline again and again, not to change it, but to make sure it was clean, precise, unemotional. I wasn't going to cry on camera. I wasn't going to rant. I wasn't going to beg anyone to take my side. I was just going to tell the truth. Before hitting record, I checked my messages one last time. There was one from him, sent at 2:17 a.m. "You're really going to do this?" No apology, no accountability, just disbelief, like he still couldn't comprehend that I no longer needed his permission. I didn't reply. I hit record. I started further back than people expected, not with the affair rumors, not with HR, not with the fallout. I started with love, with the early years, with the version of him that asked my opinion, that said we without thinking. I described the promotion not as a villain origin story, but as a turning point. I talked about the sentence that changed everything, the one he thought was reasonable. "I pay for my life," I said on camera, steady and calm. "You figure out yours." I let the silence sit after that, long enough to breathe, long enough for it to land. Then I explained what agreeing had cost me, not financially, but psychologically, how separation had been framed as equality, how independence had been demanded, not chosen, how power had disguised itself as logic. I didn't name him. I didn't name the company. I didn't need to. The truth doesn't require identifiers when it's this specific. I ended the video with a line I hadn't planned, one that came from somewhere deeper than strategy. If someone's success requires your disappearance, it isn't love, it's extraction. I uploaded it. Then I turned my phone face down and went for a walk. By the time I came back, the video had already crossed numbers that used to take weeks. Comments were pouring in faster than I could read them. Some people thanked me, some argued, some demanded names. Others shared stories that felt like mirrors held up to mine. And then the clip spread.
Someone cut the 30 seconds where I quoted him directly. It jumped platforms. It gained captions I didn't write, context I didn't choose. Strangers debated my marriage like it was a case study. Some defended him aggressively because admitting the truth would have required them to look at their own behavior. That's when the first legal email arrived. Subject line, cease and desist, urgent. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with recognition. I'd been expecting this. The letter was long, polished, full of words like defamatory implications and reputational harm. It claimed I was encouraging speculation, that my content could be construed as malicious, that I should remove the video immediately. I forwarded it to a lawyer. She called me an hour later. "You told the truth," she said, "and you were careful. They're trying to scare you." "Should I take it down?" I asked. "That's a personal decision," she replied, "but legally, you're solid." I didn't take it down. He called that night, over and over. I didn't answer. Then the messages came, angrier now, less controlled. "You know what you're doing. This is character assassination. You're destroying my future." I read them once, then archived the thread. The next morning, my lawyer forwarded me something new, a different kind of email, from a journalist I'd already declined. Short, direct. "We have independent confirmation of the investigation and resignation. We're publishing tomorrow. Would you like to comment?" There it was, the thing I'd been bracing for. The story was going public, with or without me. I stared at the email, fingers hovering. This was the fork in the road. If I commented, I'd be stepping fully into the spotlight. If I didn't, others would define the narrative from me. I thought about the woman I'd been in the kitchen with the flickering light, the one who'd agreed because it seemed easier. I thought about the notes I'd kept, the silence I'd outgrown, the messages from strangers saying my words helped them name their own reality. I replied. I didn't give them gossip. I didn't give them details they already had. I gave them one sentence, carefully chosen. I shared my experience to help people recognize unhealthy power dynamics, not to punish anyone, but to tell the truth. The article dropped the next day. This time, his name was there. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Industry forums lit up. Comment sections turned vicious. Some people dissected his career like it was already over. Others rushed to defend him, framing him as a victim of a personal dispute. He sent one final message. "I never thought you'd go this far." I read it twice, then replied, "I never thought you'd push me this far." He didn't answer. What people didn't see, what the comments couldn't capture, was what it felt like on my end, the quiet afterward, the strange calm of no longer carrying a secret that wasn't mine to protect, the grief, not for him, but for the years I'd spent negotiating my worth. But the story still wasn't finished, because exposure has consequences beyond headlines, and in the days that followed, something surfaced, something I hadn't known about, something that would force me to make the hardest decision yet. It came in the form of a message from someone I didn't expect, someone who had been watching all along, someone who knew more than I did. And when I read it, I realized the real climax of this story hadn't happened yet.
The message came at 11:43 p.m. No subject line, no emoji, just a name I didn't recognize and a sentence that made my stomach drop. "I worked under your husband. I think you deserve to know the full truth." I didn't open it right away. I stared at the notification until the screen dimmed, then lit it again like I could change the words by looking harder. This was the moment I'd been circling without realizing it, the one where the story stopped being about what I'd lost and became about what had been hidden from me. When I finally opened the message, my hands were steady. My body knew before my heart did. This wasn't drama. This was evidence. She, because it was a woman, introduced herself carefully, not with anger, not with theatrics, with restraint. She said she'd been debating whether to reach out for weeks, watching my videos, reading the comments, waiting to see if I'd disappear under the pressure or stand my ground. "You stood," she wrote, "so I think you're strong enough to hear this." She told me she'd been part of a small group who reported concerns months before his promotion, not about an affair, about patterns, Favoritism, retaliation when boundaries were set, quiet warnings passed around like contraband. She said HR had handled it internally. She said the timing of his promotion hadn't been accidental, it had been strategic. My chest tightened as I read. Each paragraph pulled back another curtain. The lunches weren't isolated, the late nights weren't random, the separation he'd demanded at home. It had coincided with an internal recommendation to minimize personal exposure. He hadn't just been protecting himself, he'd been preparing. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark for a long time, the hum of silence louder than ever. My story, what I'd told publicly, what I'd lived privately, was only half the picture. And suddenly I understood why he'd been so calm when he said that sentence in the kitchen, why he'd framed separation as logic, why he'd needed me to agree. Agreement creates witnesses who won't testify. The next morning I woke to another message from her. Attachments this time, screenshots, emails, dates that matched my notes almost perfectly. She wasn't asking for anything. She wasn't asking me to expose her. She just wanted me to have the truth. I called my lawyer. She was quiet as I explained, too quiet. When I finished, she said, "This changes the stakes." "How?" I asked. "If this becomes public, it's not just about a marriage or a resignation anymore," she said. "It's about a system, and systems fight back." I knew what she was saying. This wasn't a personal reckoning, it was institutional. If I moved forward, there would be pressure, threats wrapped in politeness, attempts to discredit me, not because I was wrong, but because I was inconvenient. I hung up and sat with the decision. I could stop. I could say I told my truth and let the rest rot quietly behind NDAs and closed doors. I could protect my peace. Or I could do the thing that would cost me comfort and give something larger back to the world. He called that afternoon. I hadn't blocked him, not yet. When I answered, he sounded different, measured, careful, like someone negotiating a settlement. "I think we need to talk," he said. "We already are," I replied. He sighed. "This has gone too far." "No," I said. "It's finally reached the truth." Silence. Then quietly, "You don't know everything." That was it, the confirmation without confession. "I know enough," I said. "You don't, and if you keep pushing, you're going to hurt people who don't deserve it." I thought about the woman who'd messaged me, about the others she mentioned, about how often "don't rock the boat" is code for "stay quiet so we don't have to change." "You already hurt them," I said. "You just called it leadership." He lowered his voice. "What do you want?" The question landed differently now, not as leverage, as fear. "I want accountability," I replied, "and I want you to stop asking me to disappear for your convenience." "You think you're the hero here?" he said bitterly. "No," I answered. "I think I'm done being collateral." I ended the call before he could respond. That night, I recorded another video, but I didn't upload it. In it, I talked about how betrayal isn't always loud, how sometimes it comes dressed as progress, how agreement, when extracted under pressure, is not consent, it's compliance. I talked about systems that reward silence and punish truth. I talked about women who are often asked to absorb damage so organizations can avoid discomfort. I watched the playback once, then I closed the file, because the next step wasn't YouTube, it was formal. I met with an investigative journalist, not for clicks, not for virality, for documentation, for corroboration, for the kind of reporting that doesn't flinch when legal teams circle. They already had pieces of the puzzle. My testimony didn't create the story, it completed it. Over the next week, I lived in a strange in-between, waiting, watching, knowing something big was coming and unable to stop it. I limited comments. I stopped posting. I protected my energy like it was oxygen. Then the expose went live. This time, there was no ambiguity. Multiple sources, internal emails, a timeline that showed how complaints had been buried, how promotions coincided with risk management, how power had insulated behavior until it couldn't anymore. His name was everywhere.
So was the company's. The response was immediate and seismic. Executives released statements, policies were reviewed, external audits announced. People I'd never met thanked me for starting something, even though I knew I hadn't started it. I'd just refused to stop it. He tried to reach me one last time. Voicemail. His voice cracked, not with remorse, but with loss of control. "You've ruined everything," he said. I listened once, then deleted it. Because in that moment, standing in my apartment with sunlight cutting across the floor, I understood the truth of it all. He hadn't ruined his life. He'd interrupted his immunity. And as the world reacted, as the story spread beyond anything I could manage, I knew the final part wasn't about him anymore. It was about what comes after truth, what comes after survival, what comes after you stop agreeing.
The morning after the exposé, the world felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful, just still, like the pause after a storm when you step outside to see what's left standing. My phone was face down on the table. I didn't need to look at it to know it was alive with noise. Notifications, opinions, apologies that weren't really apologies, praise that felt heavier than criticism. I made coffee and watched the steam rise, thinking about how ordinary everything looked for a day that had changed so much. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel the urge to explain myself. That surprised me. For months, years really, I'd been explaining, softening, translating, making my reality palatable so it wouldn't threaten someone else's comfort. But now the truth was out in the world, complete and unedited, and it no longer belonged only to me. It didn't need my defense. It stood on its own. He disappeared after that. No more calls, no more messages, no statements, just absence. The kind of absence that used to scare me and now felt like confirmation. Some people vanish when they can no longer control the narrative. Silence becomes the only leverage left. The company issued another statement, more careful this time, words like learning and commitment and moving forward. I read it once and closed the tab. Institutions speak in futures to avoid reckoning with the past. I wasn't interested in their rebranding arc. What I was interested in was the aftermath inside myself. I expected relief. I got something deeper, a recalibration. For so long, I'd measured my worth by proximity, by being chosen, included, prioritized, by being useful to someone else's success. I hadn't realized how quietly that had hollowed me out, how agreement had become a survival strategy instead of a choice. Now, with nothing left to negotiate, I could finally hear my own thoughts clearly. They weren't dramatic, they were practical. I started saying no faster. I stopped over-explaining. I stopped feeling responsible for other people's discomfort when I told the truth. The change wasn't loud, but it was irreversible. On my YouTube channel, I posted one final video about the story. Not an update, not a reaction, a closing. I told viewers what I'd learned the hard way, that independence forced on you is not empowerment, that fairness without empathy is just control in neutral colors, that the most dangerous agreements are the ones you make to keep the peace while slowly abandoning yourself. I didn't ask for sympathy. I didn't frame myself as a survivor. I framed myself as a witness to my own life and to a system that counts on silence to keep running. The comments were different this time, quieter, heavier. People weren't debating anymore. They were reflecting, sharing what they tolerated, what they were rethinking, what they were ready to stop agreeing to. That's when I understood the real ending of this story. It wasn't the resignation. It wasn't the exposé. It wasn't even the betrayal. It was the moment I stopped confusing agreement with consent. I'd agreed to separate finances because I thought it would keep love intact. I'd agreed to smaller expectations because I thought success was fragile. I'd agreed to silence because I thought speaking would cost me everything. What it cost me instead was time. Time spent shrinking, time spent doubting what I felt, time spent translating disrespect into reason. But here's the truth they don't tell you when you're in it. The moment you stop agreeing to what harms you, your life doesn't fall apart. It reorganizes. You lose people who benefited from your compliance. You lose access to rooms that required your quiet. You lose the illusion that being chosen means being valued. And in return, you gain something steadier: self-trust. I don't know what his life looks like now. I don't check. I don't wonder. Closure doesn't always come from answers. It comes from no longer needing them. I hope he learns something from this, but hope is no longer my responsibility. Mine is simpler: to never again mistake power for love, to never again call erasure maturity, to never again agree just to survive. If you're listening to this and you're standing in your kitchen holding a mug that suddenly feels ironic, if someone you love has asked you to disappear politely, logically, reasonably, hear this clearly. You are not dramatic for resisting. You are not weak for questioning. And you are not disloyal for choosing yourself. Agreement should never cost you your voice. This story didn't end with me winning or him losing. It ended with the truth standing where silence used to be, and that's the only ending that lasts. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying. And thank you for not agreeing to be small.